Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hi everyone, my name is Jezy Gray. I'm going to be the moderator for today's panel. And for recording purposes, today is Friday, April 12, 2024. It's 3:30 p.m. and this is panel number 17961.
And we'll have to get up and use the bathroom.
Hi everybody. Welcome to today's panel. I'm the moderator, Jezy Gray. I'm getting thumbs up in the back and I'm hearing that no one hears me in the front.
I can't hear you.
Can we get some tech help? Is that better? How about this? I think it's a mic issue.
Yeah, I don't think yours is working.
I've got a green light.
Hello.
Oh, mine's working.
How about that?
Do you want to swap?
At least it wasn't me.
It was not you. I always knew it wasn't you.
Thank you so much. No worries. How's this, folks?
I think she's got to turn it on.
Hey, everybody. How's that?
You good?
Welcome to today's panel. I'm the moderator, Jezy Gray. I'm the arts and culture editor at Boulder Weekly. And for recording purposes, today is Friday, April 12, 2024. It is 3:30 p.m., and this is panel number 17961, titled Horror Genre in Art, Theater, and Film. Before we get started, I need to say that the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. Another thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you all get a chance to ask questions today. And so this is how we're going to handle that. We'll reserve some time at the end of the discussion, and we'll be using a note card system. So that's how we'll be receiving questions from you all. So at any time in the session, just raise your hand, and one of our producers here in the back you'll see them right back here. They'll come by and they'll give you a note card and a writing utensil. And just be sure that you write legibly when you're putting your questions down. Be direct, and let us know if you're a student, please. And then when you finish, just raise your hand again, and the producer will bring your question up to me. So I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point, once again. So to get started now, I'd like to give a brief introduction to each of our panelists here today. First up, we have Josh Larsen. Josh is an author and critic who co-hosts the long-running radio show and podcast Film Spotting. He's also the editor of Think Christian and author of the books Movies Are Prayers and Fear Not, A Christian Appreciation of Horror. Past CWA attendees will recognize him as the host of the Ebert Interruptus film series, which this year focuses on the 2014 psychological horror film, The Babadook. Tiel Lundy is a professor in the CU Department of Cinema Studies and Moving Image Arts, as well as the Libby Residential Academic Program. Her research and teaching areas include literature, film, and material culture. Recent talks by the University of Denver PhD include a presentation on Hollywood and the lingerie industry at the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Conference. And then at the end of the table, we have Michael Spencer, who is a freelance performance maker, director, and writer, who currently serves as the director of the Southwark Playhouse Elders Company in London. He spent more than a decade as a freelance theater designer, followed by many years as an instructor at Central St. Martin's in the UK. This is Michael's 4th appearance at CWA. And then last but not least, we have Shay Wescott, a lifelong cinephile who serves on the Cinema Programming Committee at the Derry Arts Center, where she is the development manager and helps program the Friday Night Weird film series at the Bodecker Theater. This year marks a decade in Colorado for the Ithaca College grad, who serves as commissioner for the Lafayette Cultural Arts Commission and a member of the selection committee for the Boulder International Film Festival. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn things over to our esteemed panel here. I'm going to let them tell you a little more about themselves in their opening remarks. They can talk about any of the stuff I missed in their bio here. And then I'd like for each of them to talk a little bit about your connection to our subject today, which, as we know, is the horror genre in theater, art, and film. But specifically, we are also going to be asking today why this genre connects with young audiences. So we'll start with Josh. Do you want to tell us a little more about yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I am a horror fan from before I should have been a horror fan. I saw movies like Psycho and The Shining when I was far too young, and this seems to be a common story among horror fans. I won't go into all the details there, but certainly at a young age I was fascinated, scared, also fascinated, and the more I got into film and seriously watched closely movies and asked myself about the decisions filmmakers were making, so, high school age at this point, I realized that horror was very rewarding to watch in that way. You could see the techniques that were being employed to create suspense and mood. And so the love for the genre just kind of grew from there as I explored the various subgenres that horror presents, from zombie movies to monster movies, creature features, psychological horror. I mean, it goes on and on and on. It's such a rich genre. And I'm really interested in the underlying question of today's panel, which Jezy mentioned about horror's appeal to young audiences. I obviously will be speculating a bit, not talking from first-person experience, and the horror book I recently wrote, Fear Not, is not really a work of anthropology or sociology. It's film criticism and theology, really. So I can talk in generalizations, though, based on conversations I've had while getting out with the book and meeting college students at various campuses and so forth. And the one thing that does seem to be true, and first I should note, horror has always been popular with young audiences. This isn't like a recent phenomenon. I think that's always been true. But if it is uniquely popular right now, my sense from what I've heard from students is, young people nowadays are so much more in touch with their mental health than previous generations. Just aware of their personal mental health and how to be attuned to it and to take care of it, but also others' mental health and the variety of anxieties people go through. Even we're doing the Babadook for Ebert Interruptus, as was mentioned, and that film is 10 years old, and we've already been discussing, plug by the way, as soon as this is over, we're going to watch the end of the Babadook, and you could stick around and do this with us. But we've already been discussing how 10 years ago, there's a young child who's suffering from deep anxiety. Were the filmmakers thinking about it in terms of the diagnoses that children have today, whether it's ADHD or extreme anxiety? Nowadays, young people are aware of that for themselves, for others, as I said, And so horror, we often hear, I've been told, and I've experienced this myself, has a therapeutic function for all audiences. But I think young audiences in particular who are, as I said, attuned to this.
Good afternoon. I'm Tiel Lundy, and I'm Associate Teaching Professor here at CU. And as luck would have it, I'm teaching a horror class right now. I am working with mostly first-year students in that capacity, so the timing worked out really well. I am kind of a Jane Come Lately fan, I guess, to the genre. I really didn't gravitate towards it particularly, but about 10 years ago, I was asked to teach a horror course, and you do what you're asked to do, I guess, in academia. So I did, somewhat reluctantly, and I realized I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the teaching of the films, and then I came to enjoy the films themselves. But I do have to acknowledge I've got a somewhat ambivalent relationship to many horror films, because I think that while there is much to admire in some of the best of the films, both from a standpoint of craft as well as some of the thematic and cultural things that we can identify there. There's much to find fault with, particularly, misogyny continues to be, I think, a facet of the genre, although I'm looking forward to talking more about that because Josh and I had the opportunity to talk yesterday, and I think with more women moving into writer-director positions, that hopefully changes and is changing. One question that I think I have that speaks to this question of why are younger audiences drawn to the genre, and I wonder if as these younger people age, do they retain that love for it, or do they kind of age out? So that's something I guess we can talk about.
Hi, my name is Shay Wescott. I work at the Dairy Arts Center here in Boulder. We are Boulder's only year-round art house cinema, and as we mentioned during the intro, one of our programs is Friday Night Weird, which, while not entirely horror films, is really dedicated to more transgressive films that you don't normally see in that type of theater setting during the daytime. And part of my love for a program like this comes from seeing Texas Chainsaw Massacre at an early age, hence my Leatherface pin today, one of my all-time favorite movies, and really mostly for the feeling that I was seeing something I maybe shouldn't even have access to, and in fact, the film has been banned previously. And so it's just something I really enjoy in a communal setting, to have this setting where people can feel a little bit uncomfortable and have this kind of boundary pushing experience. And it's funny you mentioned the kind of misogyny in horror, because one of my actual proudest moments for Friday Night Weird is we did a screening of Herschel Gordon Lewis's Blood Feast, and while it was a small audience, it was entirely women that showed up. And so I think there is something to this catharsis of just really hyper violent films that I relate to, and I think a lot of others do as well. And then particularly with young people, as you touched upon, with mental illness and grief and loss that people go through and working through those things, I also think there is a bit of catharsis. One of my favorite tropes in horror is the idea of younger generations paying for the sins of the previous generation. So things like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. It's actually the parents in the older generation that committed these crimes that are responsible for the deaths of these villains, but it's the younger kids who are paying for them. And I think that's something that we still see as a way of people working through their traumas. I mean, it's in the title of Ari Aster's Hereditary as well, this idea of the things that we're afraid of, that we have no control over, that are being passed down to us. So I'm always really delighted to see young people interested in horror and showing up to films. And yeah, it's a passion of mine, so I'm happy to be here.
I've got an admission to make. I don't watch horror films because I get too scared. It's true. But I did ask some young people whether they watch horror, and they either said they never watched it, or they said, I do, have no idea why. So I wonder whether first we ought to ask whether young people are watching horror more now than they were before. I don't know. Josh seemed to indicate you might have some figures on this. I'd be interested. But even I think if the relative numbers have not increased, I have to ask myself why, in this so-called age of anxiety, are people watching horror? This is a generation beset with uncertainty. And not only the pandemic, we've got wars, we've got economic instability, the environment, social media paranoia. I don't know why on earth would any young person today seek out horror to experience even more anxiety. I'm a bit nonplussed at that. I'm not going to talk about cinema because I'm a theatre person, so I'm going to talk a little bit about horror in theatre and art because we've got enough film experts here. So theatre, for a start, I've got to be honest and say in theatre, horror isn't as effective as it is in cinema. Because for a start, there's no CGI, there's no money, actually. So as an example, I recently watched a production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in a small theatre in London where the transformation of the human to the monster was basically the actor pulling faces and crouching a bit. So, that's in the theatre we suspend our disbelief, and in the cinema we're presented with a reality. However, we now in theatre have the phenomenon of experiential, site-specific, immersive theatre. So I saw a very early example of this 17 years ago, which is relevant. Slung Low Theatre Productions, a production of They Only Come at Night, which was performed in an underground car park in the middle of London, which I saw. This involved a guide at the start telling an audience of 4 that we were going to search for the missing cast and that there was a rumour that, quote, some odd creatures had been seen in the lower levels of the car park. As it turned out, zombies. So, 17 years later after seeing that, theatrical horror experiences, as they are known, are now very popular and extremely lucrative. You can see them advertised online, such as one I found that's happening in the UK at the moment, Zombie Infection. So here, the audience are placed somewhere remote, like the middle of an industrial warehouse unit or a cabin deep in the woods, where they're repeatedly attacked by zombies. Actors in costume, but the cost is £100 for a 2-hour experience per person, which is not cheap. And the other thing maybe to note here is escape rooms, which are now common in most UK cities. And it's another version of this kind of participatory horror. Well, it's interesting to note that in nearly all cases, and I did look this up, it's nearly all young people going. So that's a kind of young people thing. So I just want to say theatre can compete, first of all, but not in the theatres. You have to be outside. Horror in fine art in contemporary fine art is very rare. And it usually looks back at the past, such as there's 2 UK artists, Jake and Dinos Chapman, who pay homage to Goya's brutal etchings, the horrors of war, and they make 3D models of them. But that's quite rare. They tend to look back because horror as a subject matter is more common in paintings in previous centuries, often associated with religion and warnings of damnation. So there are countless examples of this in Europe. Perhaps one of the best known is Hieronymus Bosch's 15th century painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, which presents us with a graphic and nightmarish vision of hell. There are lots of these. In the 20th century, it's interesting, we get a more secular, psychological idea of horror following Freud's revelation about the subconscious. So we get surrealists like Dorothea Tanning and René Magritte, who are really exploring the horror of our own psychosis, which is perhaps more relevant to young people. So, to finish, we're asked why young people are attracted to horror. And I thought about this and I thought maybe we first ought to ask to which young people are we referring? Because after all my examples are here in the West. What about horror in regions that are poorer or have emerging economies, such as South Asia or the Middle East? So here in Europe, our young people are watching horror as entertainment. Okay. So what if your main concern is shelter and food? So what if you're living in a war zone? Do you still take pleasure from being scared? So to conclude, I was thinking there's a question in my mind. Is looking at horror in the West from our comfortable cinemas and theatres and galleries essentially a kind of privileged indulgence for those people who actually have nothing really to fear? Or as has been suggested by some people here, and quite interesting reasons actually, is the experience of being, if only temporarily, terrified, giving young people something which they're otherwise missing in their everyday lives. And Josh talks about therapy, catharsis. I think there's something there to unpick. Thanks.
Yeah, let me follow up on, that's a really provocative question. If it's a privilege to engage with horror. My wife's a children's librarian, and so I was talking to her this morning and mentioned I was going to be on this panel, and she said, well, something somewhat similar, talking about younger kids now and reading scary stories and how they're fascinated by scary stories, and they want those. And she said, not in all cases, but, and thankfully, a lot of times, these are kids who have never really experienced anything traumatic, right? She works at, a suburb, a nice suburban library outside of Chicago. And so I think there's something to that, absolutely, that it can be, and that's not to say it's like a privilege in a bad way. There's also curiosity there, right? It's a way of learning about the world from a position of relative innocence. So yeah, that counterpoint just brought that conversation to mind. Relates to literature, but still.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I wanted to say, to Michael's point earlier, the question aside of privilege and, where and in what context you exist, and to your point about why we would seek out this anxiety-inducing content in a world that's already so uncertain, that to me is a really fascinating question. I'd love to kind of turn that on the panel a little bit. Do any of y'all have thoughts that we might unspool here in terms of why we're drawn to this in a world that's already scary enough?
There's something actually that Shay said made me interested, I'd never thought about before. And you were saying about the generation, the previous generation causing problems, and it made me think of the sins of the fathers, the expression. So my generation, of the generation that have screwed it up for the generations that followed. We've ruined the planet, we've kind of, everything's in a mess, largely because of my generation. Maybe there is something in those horror movies that he's kind of trying to work through that and trying to give, okay, well, now we can see it. It's clear, because actually it's rarely discussed or talked about, particularly in terms of the environment. I'm not saying horror films are about the environment. I'm saying they're a way, maybe, of approaching that subject.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the environment was also on my mind when I was making that statement, but also just generational traumas and the economy. I mean, films about class as horror are incredibly popular. And so I think there is something absolutely to that point. I also think it is just a natural human phenomenon, and maybe it is a bit of privilege that we seek out adrenaline. Hypothetically, humans are not supposed to like spicy foods, but it's a way that we've adapted to just kind of try something that just hurts a little bit, because there's kind of a fun behavior in that. It's also cultural, it's a learned behavior. You want to be more like your community, and so horror is definitely a communal art form as well. People like to go together to be scared. My partner has a teenage daughter, and while she doesn't go to the cinema as much as we'd like, her and her friends are always doing watch parties. So they go on Netflix or Prime or things like that, and they all start the movie at the same time, and then they're on, their phones or on Zoom or whatever, conversing with each other. So it's this way of processing together as well.
Cinema has always been, from its very beginnings, a communal experience. I think it will continue to be. I'm hopeful that it will be. But I think that more than almost any other genre, horror really lends itself to experiencing it amongst other people in real time and space. Because, when you have those jump scares and you have, 100 people in the same space all jumping at the same time, it's more powerful than if you're watching it at home alone on Netflix, I guess the same thing could maybe be said about, the melodrama and the experience of, that kind of, cathartic release there. But I really think that there is something unique about horror that lends itself to that experience. As I said, I have the good fortune of working with young viewers right now, and so when I was asked to be on this panel, I had this provocative question: why are young people attracted to the genre? And I thought about it, and I wrote some things down, and then I was like, I'll just ask them. Like, why not go right to them? And I heard a number of kind of wide-ranging responses, but one that seemed, there was a through point, I think, among most of my students, was that the fears that are expressed allegorically in horror films, they give voice to my students' own fears, and they validate their anxieties, and they feel as though I'm not alone in these fears about whether it is some kind of allegorical expression of climate change or class or race. They find comfort in the experience of watching these films precisely because it does tell them that they are, among other people, experiencing similar anxieties.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to sit in on that class yesterday, and so we were doing a little research, a little focus grouping, and I wrote down we've touched on pretty much everything that was brought up, and it's interesting, like Shay, you mentioned transgression at one point, and I don't think that word was used, but there was one student who said independence. Remember that? And it was exactly like, and she didn't mean rebelliousness, because she put it in the context of her parents. She was seeking out something that they would not watch. And she put it in the terms of independence. I thought that was interesting. Community came up, as we've said. Adrenaline rush was exactly mentioned in class. So those are elements as well. A variety of ways that students are responding. And the way they put it was interesting, like reasonable way to work out fear, one student said. And then another interesting word that was used, a controlled environment to meet fears. So yeah. Reasonable, controlled, not what we associate with like what's happening up on the screen, but this is what's being experienced.
Yeah, it's interesting. Tiel's answer is very interesting to my question as to why would people seek out in a world of such anxiety, but it's precisely because of that world of the age of anxiety that is the reason they're seeking these things out. I had one other thought that we live in a very a couple of times people have said catharsis, this kind of extreme emotional response to something. And I think we do live in a world that is very risk averse. Young people particularly are protected all the time from things. You can no longer go out and just explore the world. You've got to be back on time. Everything is very risk averse. And I wonder whether the horror film actually gives a chance of a tangible experience of feeling something emotional that is scary that you can't get because you're so protected in this risk averse world. I don't know.
Well, I think that's particularly why it's so important that we have many different storytellers, that we're able to see what that catharsis looks like through the eyes of filmmakers who are women, who are people of color, who are queer. I think a lot about, revenge movies, not always horror movies, but generally share a lot in common, and how many great revenge films there have been. In fact, Jennifer Kent, the director of The Babadook, her follow-up film was, oh my gosh, what is the name?
Nightingale?
The Nightingale, thank you so much. And that is a revenge film, and through the eyes of a woman, where we kind of get to see a few different stages of revenge. And there's a point midway through where you see the most traditional form of her revenge, and where you would expect the catharsis to be, and it's not quite there. And her ultimate revenge and her ultimate catharsis is something that turns out to be maybe a little bit more uniquely feminine. And that was something that really intrigued me, that I think we're starting to see a little bit more of.
Yeah, in fact, I wanted to push us a little further in that direction, because we've mentioned a couple of us have flagged the problematic elements that we might associate with these hyper-violent horror films, especially when we think of like kind of the classic genre of like slasher film or something like that. But I'm curious to hear from the panel if we see other instances of something like the misogyny problem. If we see that changing as the tent becomes bigger or as audience expectations change, do we see that anywhere in the culture?
I mean, just in the movies that I see coming through the pipeline that I'm reviewing, I would say yes. It goes back to your perspective element, Shay, and even the Nightingale. There's that feminine perspective you mentioned, but also, is it New Zealand or Australia? It's
Australia.
Is it, okay, it's dealing with, there's an Aboriginal character, and so it's dealing with historical trauma and sin as well, which is, again, perhaps not Kent's personal background, but she's bringing that to this story, to the horror genre, where it wouldn't necessarily have been a setting that a horror movie would explore. So I am seeing films like that. Another one in here, I'm going to go blank. The movie is Relic. I forget the name of the woman filmmaker, the woman director, but it is a movie all about the horror of dementia. But it's very much a horror movie. I mean, it gets gross. Pardon me? Jacob's Ladder was, it's been so long since I've seen that. But Relic was, I feel like, I don't know that 20 years ago, if it was just, the genre was just dominated by men, we would have a horror movie that's all about a middle-aged woman's relationship with her mother who is suffering from dementia and her daughter who is coming to help and realizing that this is, this is running in the family line. And this is a horror that probably the majority of the people in this room, their lives have been touched in some way. And here's a filmmaker, making a very fantastical version of that experience. I feel like that's because the tent is bigger. But if you program, Shay, you probably know better than me what options there are out there to, what is being made and what it's representing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, while I think nowhere near perfect, we're definitely seeing, like I said, just more diverse voices behind the camera. And I think audiences are really asking for that too. I mean, generally, it's kind of a great rule that we've come to find that if a film has queer themes, young people will show up. So every film that is, queer revenge, queer horror, we're like, let's do it, because people like it, and we get to introduce this new audience who otherwise also might not feel welcome in their space or in our space or know that programming is even happening. So that is definitely something that's becoming more prominent, but I mean, there is absolutely still the same old misogyny, and there is still the kind of, bro type horror of.
It's interesting until Tiel mentioned it. I feel stupid saying this, but I never thought of it as a misogynistic genre. And now I think of it, it's so obvious. It is so obvious. It is always the female running away from the. I mean, going back to the 50s, running away from the monster and screaming and defenseless. And yeah, there is a film I was trying to remember. And the trouble is with doing this panel, you think, I can't remember the film and I can't remember any. And I was trying to think of the actress, and I couldn't remember her, but she was in The Girl with the Pearl Earring. That's all I can remember. And that was her breakthrough film, and she's Scarlett Johansson. Scarlett Johansson was in a film where she was a female who was a kind of killer. She was killing men, and it was kind of horror.
Oh, you're talking about Under the Skin?
Yes.
Yes.
That's amazing. I mean, and that's, when I thought about it, that's the only film I've seen that kind of turned the tables, really, and the men were the victims, and she was absolutely in control, and this killer. Under the Skin, that's it. I can't remember who made it. Can you remember?
Jonathan Glazer.
Jonathan Glazer, of
Yeah.
course.
Yes.
Yes, amazing. Yeah, who's just made an award-winning film, hasn't he? He's just made.
Yes,
Sorry.
Zone of Interest.
Zone of Interest, of
which
course.
just won Best International Feature.
It's an amazing film, and a sort of horror. Only, a different kind of horror, maybe. Anyway, sorry. Jonathan Glazer, yeah.
One filmmaker we haven't talked about is Jordan Peele, who gets brought up in a lot of these conversations in terms of like a new guard of the horror genre, heralded for his, turning social issues over in the light through his films. But it strikes me that this is, on its face, not exactly new. It seems like we've been working through cultural anxieties through horror in various ways. Frankenstein and the Industrial Revolution, for example. But I'm curious if the way that's being done today by filmmakers like Jordan Peele et al., what's different about it? If the fundamental, using the genre and using those filmmaking techniques to explore the things that are making us anxious as a culture, like if that itself has always kind of been part of the game, what's different now in these new crops of films over the past, say, 10 years, 15 years?
I'm just, thinking on my feet here, but, it seems like, particularly when you think about Jordan Peele's films, these are films that they don't even really allegorize the threat or the monster. They take it head on. Whereas something like Frankenstein or The Bride of Frankenstein or, Dracula, they really kind of wrap those cultural anxieties in a pretty safe cloak of metaphor. So, Dracula from 1931, it becomes a metaphor for xenophobia and for anti-Semitism that was really widespread then. But it's still a vampire movie. That's one of the big differences I think I see.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that with Peele, but you're very right, especially with Get Out, his breakout film, right? So I think Peele is connected to what we were just talking about with the bringing in more diverse voices. As a black filmmaker, his debut is very much concerned about racial divisions in the U.S. and white supremacy, really, and it's there in the plot, as Tiel is saying. It's not metaphorical at all. In the book, I look at different subgenres in each chapter, and so I put Peele in a chapter what I call prophetic horror, which is thinking of Old Testament prophets calling out society for their sins. And this is what Peele has been doing, to my mind, with especially with his first two films, Get Out I mentioned, and then Us, interestingly, I find it not so much concerned with race, but class, which has already come up on the panel, and the sins of the American class system, American consumerism in particular. I won't go into the crazy plot of Us. It'll take too long. But it is also prophetic in the sense that it is calling a people to an awakening of a national sin. And in the case of that film, I read it as consumerism, and what that costs others for those of us who are, again, comfortable, privileged, have so many products. What are we willing to make others suffer so we can live that way? That's what I see in Us. It's pretty literal as well. Now that you're mentioning that.
I think in some ways it hasn't changed that much, because you think about something like Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley, very early 19th century. Okay, so what it's about is actually a fear of the other. Is othering. She's othering somebody who's not like everybody else, and she has a great sympathy for that and makes a horror film of it. Shay talked about the attraction of horror involving queer politics, for example, which is kind of, again, about othering, or about acknowledging othering. Jordan Peele is looking at it in terms of race. In some ways, they're all doing a similar thing. They're all looking at recognizing it and turning that into the metaphor of horror, if you like, of actually being able to discuss that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's necessarily a new phenomenon, but I do think it is more on the nose. films wear their heart on their sleeve, their politics are in your face. And, you know, that can, in some ways, make them feel maybe a little bit preachy, or, you know, like they can become almost plug and play, like, you know, a class horror movie is now something you can just kind of make by the book. But at the same time, I think, you know, part of it is maybe a purposeful thing of wanting audiences to know exactly what you are about, and not wanting someone to be able to go in and say, oh, I didn't get that at all. It's like, no, you know exactly what this film is supposed to be making you feel, and maybe you, in fact, are the villain.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in an interview right before, I think, the release of Get Out, I think this was with Terry Gross, Jordan Peele said that he was really inspired by the work of Ira Levin. So the films of, he specifically cited Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives. And, you know, we can look at those for some very, very clear social commentary about, you know, reproductive rights, you know, female bodily autonomy. And, you know, you can kind of see how his own kind of, you know, I guess, worldview was inspired by these earlier people, and in particular, like I said, Ira Levin's work.
Something I'd like to talk about is, you know, we're hashing out these sort of top line thematic social considerations about, you know, how young people are responding to horror. But maybe we could talk a little bit about, like, what's in the techniques of these films that makes them, like, so delicious, you know, that keeps us coming back to this well and scaring ourselves to death. Like, why are these films so fun, I guess, is the question.
I'm not a film expert.
I actually was going to sort of bounce it over to you, because I'm curious, you know, you acknowledge that there are certain challenges in doing horror on a stage,
Yeah,
but
there are.
how does one do it, and how do you make it scary?
Well, I have to say, I've never seen anything on the stage. I've seen some horror things. I've seen productions of Frankenstein, The Woman in Black. It's usually not that great, I have to say. In terms of, you're not really scared. I'm not scared. The reason I don't watch horror films is because I get too scared. I literally, and I see something coming and I can't because I'm terrified by it. I've never had that experience, anything like that in the theatre. The thing that I was pointing out that maybe is theatrical is this idea, and I guess it comes back to the experience, the catharsis thing of going through something, because young people want to actually be in a space where there are zombies actually attacking them, you know? I mean, and they're paying a lot of money for that, and sometimes it's the whole weekend. I mean, this is big money, you know? It's very commercial. So what that's telling us is that they want to feel something. They want to feel something in still a safe space, okay? But they want to feel something that is extreme, which they can't experience in their everyday lives. Going back to, you know, the risk-averse thing. Let's put ourselves in a really difficult position. So that's when it works in theatre terms, and it is theatre because it's live, as opposed to recorded on the screen. That's when it works. I don't think it ever really works in the conventional theatre, not that I've ever seen.
Can I share a theatrical horror experience that
Sure,
was
yeah.
very scary? And it'll tie to your question, which why it's delicious.
Yeah.
That's great. It does get delicious. So this was around Halloween. We went to, in Chicago, there was I forget what they called it, but it was in a garage as well, next to Steppenwolf Theater. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Steppenwolf, but they have a little tiny theater in their garage, their parking garage. And they gave it over to a puppet production company where you would go in, and you had to wait in a creepy lobby, and it was all dark, and then you would get to go with a small group through a curtain like this, and they would have 6, maybe 7 little stages set up where you peeked through these little peepholes, and then you would see some sort of single stage story sort of play out. And the one that came to mind first, a lot of them, there was like body horror, they were gross, they were weird, but there was one where they're laying on the ground was out of crumpled paper, the shape of a body. And you're looking at it, and you're just staring at it, and you can like see someone in this corner is also looking, and you're kind of looking in their eyes, like what's going on here. So it's kind of communal too. And just slowly, ever so slowly, the paper would rise in a way where it looked like this figure was breathing. It wasn't scary like I jumped back, but it was like, ugh. And that was the production. It was like 3 to 5 minutes. And there would be other movements. And so part of my mind is feeling freaked out in a way, a low-level way. And part of my mind is like, how did they do this? Like, what level of artistry is at work? And even though after like minute 4, I'm like, okay, I see the string. I think I see the string where the artist is somewhere just, gently pulling it and then making that body seem to fill with air. So that same deliciousness, for me watching horror is seeing that on the screen. So Tiel, forgive me, I talked about The Shining in your class, so you've already heard me say this, but those of you who've seen The Shining and think about those big wheel scenes where the little boy's riding through the hotel hallways and just feeling so out of sorts when that's happening every time I watch the movie, but then another part of my mind thinking, why? What are the choices being made? And then you learn about it, you read about it, or just from watching a lot of movies, they're using this Steadicam camera that the camera operator is sitting in a wheelchair, following this boy, allowing for a single take, so there's no cut, there's no edit. So that means we don't get a break, we can't get away from this kid, we're locked in with him, even though we don't want to be. And also the movement of the camera is also, it's as if the camera is pulling us in. So it's very visceral. And this is what horror does so well. It's the adrenaline rush element, whether you're young or not. And for me, that's kind of the deliciousness of it. I think horror does that amazingly well.
Yeah.
And I think, so since you noted the visuals in Kubrick's The Shining, I think that sound is so important also, particularly for this genre, because if you think about your experience, if you are in a real experience of fear or even terror, you walk into your house and you fear that somebody may have broken in, you're going to be listening for all you're worth, and every single tiny discrete sound is going to be amplified in some way. And really good horror films, they work with the sound landscape so effectively. And that's not to say that, obviously there were silent era horror films like Nosferatu, but I think that some of my favorite horror films, like The Exorcist, the sound in The Exorcist, all of those, the sound effects that are part of that kind of, the fabric of the sonic landscape are so powerful. So I think more than other genres, sound is really critical to it and gives it just that much more, kind of visceral power.
Yeah, I totally agree. Sorry, I just want to say I totally agree, because that's why I can't watch horror films. It's not actually the thing that I've seen that horrifies me. It's the start of the music that tells me something terrible is going to happen, and that's why I switch off, because I can't take it. No, I can't take it. No, I don't want to do it.
I just wanted to quickly add, while we are on this thread of technique, the unsung hero that is editing, which you kind of touched on with The Shining. Part of the reason that scene is so scary is that it does not cut. Yes. And we think about horror as being so many jump scares, which would be a very quick cut, but I think some of the scariest scenes can be the ones that are just held for far too long. We're so attuned to the language of cinema that we know when the scene is supposed to end, and when it doesn't, we become more and more increasingly uncomfortable. And one great recent experience in the theater, we showed the film Skinamarink, which
Love Skinamarink.
so fabulous, and just the collective panic attack that everyone was. So for folks unfamiliar, it's a very experimental film. Basically, the entire film is a child who is left alone at night. He is up around in his house, and it is all just from that perspective. And it's basically like you're walking through this dreamscape nightmare with this kid as they are up all night and you don't know what's real and what's not. But some of the most effective scenes are just staring at a wall from a really weird angle for like a minute straight. And the more you do it, you're just like, I have to look away from this wall. I am going to die if we don't cut away from this wall.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Shay. I wanted to formulate a question around Skinamarink or a film like We're All Going to the World's Fair.
Another good one.
And, just these deeply strange and scary films that you can't really, explain to people why they're scary,
They don't have monsters. It's, I think it's back to the psychological experience that they're, neither of those, right? Would you say have a monster?
Yeah, no, not really. We're All Going to the World's Fair was my favorite movie of, I guess it was maybe 2 years ago. Yeah, just really incredible film. And again, very, very simplistic, also made entirely during COVID. So there's basically one actor and a couple of voices in the film.
It's amazing. We've got a few audience questions. We're narrowing in on our last 20 minutes or so I want to make sure I get as many of these in as I can. One is from a student who asks, what's a horror film you couldn't finish, either because of the fear factor or because it was just so bad?
Everyone.
Yeah, I thought you might have an answer. Anybody else, have you ever bailed on a movie because it just sucked or was too scary?
I can't even say it without laughing. Yamageddon, like llamas, but Llamageddon. I swear, it's a real thing. I stumbled upon it on Netflix.
Wait. No, we need more.
Let's unpack this.
Because it was so bad or because it was so scary?
It was beyond bad.
Okay.
It was absolutely atrocious. I don't even know how they got it on Netflix. It's awful.
So, so I have more, at this point I have choice over, what I'm going to watch pretty much. But for many years I was a daily newspaper film critic, and the job was to review what came out in theaters that weekend, no matter what. And this was during the Saw era, the Hostel era. And I think this goes to your point, Tiel, about these films are, 10, 15 years old now at this point, but still, that it can be a problematic genre still. Right? And these are movies that, if you're unfamiliar with them, there's just a lot of bodily torture. I think it was David Edelstein, the critic, coined the term torture porn around that era for movies like these. So it was my job to see these, and it was I don't even remember if it was a Hostel or a Saw film. It was one of the sequels. They were being made at that point, almost every year. There was one or the other. And I had to go, but I couldn't leave. It was my job to be there. So I did just kind of, after a while, end up just looking at my shoes. Didn't help with the sound. So now, I'm not saying those movies crossed a line that none of us should step past. But I am saying for me, they felt to be about the desecration of the body. A lot of American action films are very much about the same thing, but we'll take our kids to those. But anyways, for me, that in particular was, not something I would have sat through. Now, if someone wants to give me a very spirited defense of the Saw movies, I'm totally willing to hear it. I'd be fascinated by that, But yeah, that was one that came to mind for me.
Well, it's funny, we actually had a question about the relationship between, someone asked, is there a through line or a connection between pornography and horror in terms of what they say, the arousal and the adrenaline rush in a sanitized world?
Well,
question asker
I was
says.
going to say, you've got to look at some vampire films for that. I mean, because the whole thing is kind of mixed up with sex and desire, and comes from the idea of unconscious desire. The woman in the vampire film classically wants to be eaten, to be sort of kissed and have her blood taken. It's that. I mean, it's definitely in there. It's about unconscious desires, surely.
There's a really famous scholarly article in my field written by Linda Williams, who was a graduate of CU. And she terms them body genres, and she lists porn, horror and the weepies or melodramas, because all three of these really enact bodily responses from the viewer, but of course they also portray whether it's violations to the body or they involve the body as represented on the screen. So yeah, there's actually a lot of scholarship on that very question.
Yes.
Shay, we've got a question for you. Someone wants to know if you could talk more about class as horror, e.g. Parasite is the example they gave us.
Yeah,
good one.
I mean, yeah, so Parasite is a great example. In fact, we just did a course at the Dairy called How to Watch a Movie that we break down kind of all the different ways that you can look at film critically, and the film that we all watched together was Parasite. And so we just had a very lengthy discussion on both the class elements and the environmental elements within Parasite. But I agree with Josh. I think Us, which actually came prior to Parasite, Jordan Peele's film, is probably one of the slightly earlier examples of class in horror film. This idea that those that we benefit from, that live underneath us, that we don't have to think about ever coming to take what is theirs, is, I think, very much part of what drives all of these class films. Bong Joon-ho had another film very on the nose about class, Snowpiercer, in which there is everyone lives on a train in this dystopian world, and of course the lowest classes are in the back of the train, and one day they decide to fight their way up to the front and see the different classes, literally the train cars that each different class is existing in. There are plenty of examples of films that play on a lot of the same tropes. We just had a film pretty recently called Raging Grace, and it's I believe Vietnamese woman, I might be mistaken about that, who is working in a wealthier person's home and basically takes her revenge for her mistreatment. So yeah, it's something that there are just a lot of films that deal with that kind of topic, and there's of course an intersection of race and gender in those films as well.
Yeah, it does seem to be, we're getting more films on that topic recently because it's relevant to what we're all experiencing, I think, in the world now. But it's always interesting to look back and think about older films that were also dealing, horror films, with class too. And I always find this whenever I think, oh, this must be where it started. Then, the next week I'll hear about an earlier movie. But the one that's coming to mind now is People Under the Stairs, which was made by the same director, Wes Craven, who made Nightmare on Elm Street. So People Under the Stairs is 1991. And the idea there is that there is this brother and sister living in this, just crazy mansion, who own all the property in a slightly downtrodden neighborhood, and they're just like, they're raising the rents, they're trying to squeeze people out. And so some of it's been a while since I've seen it, but basically people in the neighborhood try to sneak into this mansion to rob them, as, because they're in an act of justice, essentially, because they've been robbed by them. And let's just say they find stuff in the basement. And it's very much this, visceral horror movie, but the class dimensions are all over it. I mean, it's very in your face that this is what Wes Craven wanted to make a movie about, are these class divisions, the exploitation of the underclass. The landlords are the killers. I mean, that's, right? That's it.
Well, and home invasion films in general as a subgenre are almost inherently entirely about class. Even, obviously they spun into many different political topics, but I would argue that The Purge, the original Purge, could be viewed as a class film.
Yes. Yep.
It's funny, I'd never have thought of Parasite as a horror film. I mean, it's not. There is horror in it, there is killing in it, there is violence in it, but I wouldn't call it a horror film personally.
Sure.
I don't know what defines it, but I mean, maybe it's an interesting question.
No, I think it very purposely plays with genre in a way that's ambiguous and not entirely just horror.
Yeah.
We've got about 10 more minutes. I think we can probably tease out one more question. Before we do, I have 2 film reviews for you, Tiel, or 2 film suggestions, I'm sorry. A student suggests if you hated Lamageddon, you should watch Killer Pinata.
The follow-up.
As well as Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey.
Oh, yeah.
Winnie the what?
That's for your Netflix queue. So
Winnie the Pooh,
Okay,
Blood and
where is this student? We need to talk afterwards.
find her after the panel. Here's a question I thought was pretty interesting to kind of take us back in time a little bit. Could you discuss the links between fairy tales in horror films? Whether the cautionary element or, instructional.
Yeah, this did come, was it in class? Did that come up, or it might have been somewhere else? Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, not a scholar in this area, but my understanding is like the Grimm fairy tales in particular were like very early scared straight stories. Is like they were kind of instructional, gruesome, way more gruesome than the animated variations that maybe they've come to be more associated with. So there's, maybe a practical element to that. Stay out of the woods because you could die, which at that time in those places was probably good advice.
Probably.
I'm really struggling to think of an example of a film that is very obviously a horror film that's very obviously based on one of those fairy tales that we can. And I'm sure, maybe I'm just just drawing a blank, but.
Well, they were kind of sanitized, right, by Disney and by and
Oh yeah.
right. So that I'm sure there are some, but
I mean, while not necessarily a direct fairy tale, the film that came to mind for me was The Witch, Robert Eggers' film.
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, and that
Stay
has
out of
that
those
element of
woods,
stay out of
for
the
sure.
woods, exactly.
Yeah, that's a great example. We also have a question. This is formulated for John in terms of the connection between how horror is rendered in the fine arts versus film. I think this person specifically talking about visual arts, painting and sculpture specifically. But what their question gets at is the notion of the uncanny. This person says that is typically where the horror comes from more in that other medium, but perhaps we could talk about the uncanny in film as well, or what that connection is. You could start us off.
I'm not. I can't answer because I'm not that familiar with the term. Although I have used it, I have heard it used in sort of fine art critique to sort of I don't really want to go there because I'm not
Sure.
sort of qualified. I'm not
I
qualified
could
to
probably
say.
speak to that because I've
Yeah.
just been teaching that in
Right.
my horror film class. But that's how I frame Kubrick's The Shining, is through that lens of Freud's idea of the Unheimlich, or the uncanny, which also can be translated to the unhomey. And it's the notion of something being at once familiar and unfamiliar to the extent that it's almost alien. And Freud said that this experience comes from the repetition. And so, there's nothing more familiar for many of us, at least, than, the family home that we grew up in, right? If you lived in the same house for 15 years or more, then every creak on every, the third step is the one you want to skip, and right? But and I think that's why The Shining is so scary, is because it's dealing with that idea of the repetition over and over again. And when something ceases to be familiar in a comforting way, all of a sudden it's shocking in an unfamiliar kind of alien way. The uncanny is a great. It really is an interesting lens that opens up a lot of horror films, especially horror films that I think are ghost stories, which is how I categorize The Shining.
And in fact, some of the scariest moments in cinema that come to my mind, are not even necessarily in a horror film, but I'm thinking of someone like David Lynch who does that so well, right? Just putting you in a space that is not right in some way. Something's off. And that can be just unsettling in a way that no jump scare ever could.
Well, it works in the way surrealism works. It presents us with the familiar, but then the familiar is not quite, we know there's something wrong, even though we recognize it. It's not abstract or artificial, it's real, surreal, misplaced.
I think the Babadook actually has some very uncanny horror moments. I personally think the films of Georges Méliès, while incredibly impressive, are absolutely terrifying. And it's this odd phenomenon where, you know, what they're doing on screen is actually just very silly, and it's mostly people playing around, but just because of the technique and the frame rate, people move in this kind of herky-jerky way that is just so off-putting, and then the Babadook kind of plays upon that, putting him in these films and moving like this puppet as well, and I find it very eerie.
We've got a question here circling back to something we had mentioned briefly about the communal value of viewing cinema in the theater. And this person asks, as a reluctant viewer of horror, they're wondering, is the audience in those settings, are they expressing a cathartic joy and release, or are they simply finding pleasure at the movies?
Well, that was kind of my last question, but I think there is something that people are getting out of it. I think it is a kind of release. It's not just entertainment. I criticized that it could just be entertainment, but the point I was making is, which I don't know, what is it like for people not in the West seeing? What is it like for somebody who's in a very different country, which is much poorer, and they haven't, and they're, you know, would they seek out the same thing? Would they get something out of it in the same way as young people do in the West? I'm not sure. But clearly people in the West are getting something out of it that is important, that they're not getting in any other way in their lives. I don't think you can deny that.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Shay on this about, as a programmer, it's hard to read an audience, you know, the vibe in an audience. I can say that I think you probably, in my experience, get both. Going back to Saw, like I'm not sure. I've been at screenings of those movies or Hostel, and I'm not sure what people are cheering. I can't, it seems very apart from my experience of what I'm seeing. But then there's something like last Sunday, the Music Box Theater in Chicago is doing a 3D festival. So we went to see Creature from the Black Lagoon, 1954 monster movie. It was in 3D because, 3D festival, so we all wore glasses, sold out, huge, like old-fashioned, Palace Theater type setting. And people were hooting and hollering, and maybe because it's old. I would argue the special effects are amazing in it. It's not dated. But that was incredibly communal in and that's not a movie anyone would probably say was scary, even in 1954. But it was a joyous sort of experience. So I felt a variety of vibes in horror movies.
I'd go to that.
That would be a good place for you to start.
I'd go to that.
But yeah, Shay, I don't want to put you on the spot, but like you're as programming a lot like these types of movies. Do you think it's possible to get a vibe from an audience, or are there just too many different individual experiences going on?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, it's actually sometimes one of the worst experiences in the world for me to watch a film in our theater, because I can't actually watch the film. I have to look around at what everybody else is doing, and if someone's on their phone or they're fidgeting or they're looking around, it's like I take it so personally, even if it wasn't like my choice in film. Or, it's just, yeah, it can be devastating. So sometimes I almost try to have tunnel vision and not pay attention to those things. We are very lucky that we are a small, so our theater is only 70 seats, and you are very close to each other, so you're hyper aware of what everyone is going through if the show is sold out. And so there is something to that, there might be just a response that you kind of can't help. You jump or you laugh or whatever, but you're forced to engage with the person next to you because you've probably hit them in the process, or like they're very aware of what you're doing. I think more than just that, the most rewarding experience is actually seeing folks engage at the end of a film. So it's one thing to try to figure out what's happening during the process of watching it, but it's really in the lobby when people are coming out and talking after, or we actually host a lot of talkbacks after films where we'll do like a community discussion and have a speaker, and that's really where you can gauge how many people, really felt something during the film. It's one of my favorites. It's so funny. It's like how many times we've had a talk back for a film and we'll remind them over and over, like, stay after the film, we're going to talk about it. And how many people will just leave at the end and I'll hear a comment of like, gosh, I wish I knew what that was about. We're literally just about to tell you.
Oh, that's funny. All right, folks, it is 4:40. So thanks to our panelists and thanks to all of you for being here today. We appreciate it.